humans, we typically develop hearing even before we're born, so about like 18 months after
Yeah.
pregnancy begins. So owls, on the other hand, don't start developing hearing 2 weeks post-hatch.
Our guest for today is Courtney Cushman. Courtney is currently studying in Drew University, majoring in psychology and minoring in Spanish and education. We are going to talk about comparative psychology, and her topic is the auditory and sensory ability of owls, guided by Professor Drew Diamore. We talked about what is auditory and sensory, the importance of hearing for owls, early development of hearing for owls, brain function and development for owls, adaptive plasticity, and inaccuracy for owls, such as sound localization. Right. Thank you, Courtney, for coming here.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me.
So your topic is about sensory and perception, a deeper look into the auditory and sensory ability of owls, right?
Yes.
So let's start from the basics. So what is auditory and sensory ability?
So auditory sense is our ability to hear. So just in simple terms, like
Yeah.
how we hear every day. And in my paper, I talk about specifically the complex and heightened sensory abilities of owls,
Yeah.
specifically barn owls, and how they use it for sound localization and distinguishing space.
Yeah, so let's go to the importance of hearing for owls.
Mhm.
I know there's a couple sections, but I would like to start with survival and
Mhm.
longevity. So we know that owls use listening more than visuals, right?
Mhm.
So why is that?
Not necessarily that they use it more, just like
Uh,
when they can't see, like it's like they tap more into that certain sense.
yeah,
Like especially if they're in the dark and they obviously can't see, they have to tap into their hearing to use different localization cues to
yeah.
like detect their prey, which is
Uh,
also a big reason why they're so precise when hunting, because when they have both those senses combined, like when they're
yeah.
able to hear and see, they are extremely accurate when hunting.
So like during that time, during that moment, like how does it affect the brain of the owl?
So when analyzing the brain in terms of hearing, the optic tectum plays a
Yeah,
huge part in that. So there's parts of the brain which allow like tuning of neurons to auditory localization cues and respond to those specific sounds. So like
yeah.
as they're hearing the things going on around them, there's certain cues going off in their head that are allowing them to track down the prey.
Yeah, I know this is not in your paper, but I would like to ask is that since owl is like a night animal,
Mm-hmm.
do you think there's like their brain is different from humans or like other morning animals?
Yeah, I think that kind of goes into another part, like adaptive plasticity,
Yeah.
kind of going on because obviously they've kind of adapted to hunt at night and stuff like that.
Yeah,
Just like it's the
so
way they
yeah,
act
adaptive
chronically.
plasticity is like in the end of the paper, as we
Mm-hmm.
know. So let's do you want to slowly go down, or should we
Yeah,
just
yeah.
jump to
We
adaptive
can
plasticity first?
we can talk about tracking prey first if
All
you
right,
want.
sure. So when we go to tracking prey for owls, like
Mm-hmm.
how do owls like track its prey by hearing?
So the main thing
Yeah.
is through auditory sensitivity.
Uh-huh.
So they have the ability to recognize really like minuscule differences between sound frequencies in their left
Yeah.
and right ears, which is how they track their prey. So if they hear something, they're like immediately, well, maybe not immediately, but just like through hearing stuff in both of their ears, they have a lot of precision when hunting.
Oh, so how do owls track its prey, its prey accurately with hearing? Because like
Hmm.
left and right, like when I mean like when you see an owl like listen from this side,
Hmm.
like for let's use us as human. Like when we hear here, we just like look there, but we
Yeah.
couldn't know like exactly where is it.
Yeah.
But owl they could. So like let's talk more about that.
Yeah, I definitely think like the accuracy has to do a lot with like just the extreme sensitivity they have in their
Yeah.
ears, along with a lot of nerve impulses that travel to neurons in the midbrain, which
Mhm.
form auditory space maps, which is something I
Yeah.
also talk a lot about. So
Yeah.
they're kind of just making a mental image of what's going on around them, even if they can't see it. Like they're hearing and they're
Yeah.
creating like this auditory space map.
So is that more like an assumption? Like they assume like oh like they assume like for example like 5 meters from me there's like
Hmm.
a prey right there, so I'm gonna just fly there and just gonna grab
Yeah,
it.
I think at the beginning, like when first hearing something, I think it's more of an
Yeah.
assumption, like kind of likely to be inaccurate, but after like a few tries they like of hearing something, then they're like usually like on point.
Wow.
And I also talked about a study conducted in
Uh-huh.
1973 that
Okay.
showed that they can just track, like there was a study conducted where they were able to
Yeah.
track prey without being able to see them at all with mice.
Wow. Do you mind talk more about that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So they were in a space. I think it was I don't remember how many. It was like 6 or 7 owls. They were in
Yeah.
a confined space with um it was one owl and one mouse, and there was like different platforms where they
Mhm.
could walk and they like wouldn't be able to hear them. So
Yeah.
they tracked like the inaccuracies, like when they weren't able to hear them at all, they were more likely to be inaccurate when trying to catch them. But then when they could hear them rustling around on the ground, then they were like 100% accurate.
That was so cool. Cause
Yeah.
like imagine if you take like a cloth and just like cover our eyes.
Yeah.
Like I have no idea what game is that, but like I know in the States like people do take a baseball and like whack at the like a unicorn
Oh
thing.
yeah, like a little pinata.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
like like when looking at that, I was like trying I did try it alone back home in Malaysia.
Hmm.
I was like trying to whack it, but I just couldn't find where is it. But like listening to like how owls can assemble it and like make it so accurately
Hmm.
it is just so amazing.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, so let's talk about like the early hearing development of an
Hmm.
owl. So let's start with like cue localizations
Hmm.
and distinction of auditory space. So you stated that us as human, our auditory sense typically developed before we are born. So it's not an owl. Like, please talk about that.
Yeah, so as humans, we typically develop hearing even before we're born, so about like 18 months after
Yeah.
pregnancy begins. So owls, on the other hand, don't start developing hearing 2 weeks post hatch. So after they hatch, there's like a 2 week period where they like don't really have the skill at all, and then it starts developing. And as it becomes more pronounced, there are a lot of like connections between the nucleus, called the nucleus magnocellularis and nucleus laminaris, that form and mature over time. And this is like the most vital stage of hearing development, that takes place within the first 2 months of their life.
So like when we look at this question, like us human like we develop like before we are born, but owls
Yeah.
don't. Like so for example, if we human train the skill, do you think we are able to like have this thing?
Um, you mean like if we didn't develop hearing until like
Yeah.
later? I
Yeah.
think definitely it leaves a lot of room for like hearing impairment, like
Uh-huh.
because a lot of the studies that I researched, if
Uh-huh.
anything was kind of messed up in that like 2 week or 2 month period, then their
Yeah.
hearing was like affected like throughout their entire life.
Wow.
Yeah, so I think like being able to develop hearing as humans like early on, like before we're even born, I think that's definitely um it's I don't know, it's a different process, but I think it's like really interesting to see how like vulnerable their hearing is when they're first born.
Yeah, I mean like it makes so much sense. And like for my last podcast with
Hmm.
Sam, she did mention that for us human, like when we're younger, we tend to like adapt more languages.
Yeah.
We tend to like understand more, like not to say understand, but like we just tend to learn
Yeah.
faster. So like I do you think that it is the same in hearing?
I think it has a lot of like correlation. Like obviously like when we're at like the early stage of our life, like we're
Yeah,
more like able and like willing to learn new things because we're
yeah,
like it's just such a like important period in our like brain development. And like our brains are still developing even today, like at our age. But it's just I
yeah.
think that's like the vital period definitely
Uh-huh.
has a big connection.
So like how long does an owl like develop that skills?
So the most important, it's like 2 weeks, and then like
Uh-huh.
2 months is like the main development that's going
Uh-huh.
on.
Yeah, so like let's talk about the evidence. You did
Hmm.
mention about like the ITD
Yeah.
and the ILD. Like, do you mind like talk about
Yeah, of
that?
course.
Yeah.
So those are two main topics or like
Okay.
terms you could say in my paper that I use. So ITD stands for interoral time difference,
Mhm.
which is the difference between the sound and the rate at which it enters one of our ears versus the other.
Mhm.
So in owls, like the studies conducted have a lot to do with that. And then
Mhm.
ILD is interoral level difference,
Mhm.
which has to do with sounds being more intense in the ear that is on the same side it's coming from. So, like, for example, if an owl is processing a sound that's coming from this ear,
Yeah.
it's going to be more likely to hear it more intensely on like their left side more than their right.
Wow. That's so cool.
Yeah.
So like the thing is like we do know that like when sounds come from frequencies, right?
Yeah.
So like do owls have like a special ability like for example us as human even the sound come from here but like
Hmm.
both of our eardrums like the beat of our eardrums should be around like the same frequency, right? So,
I think their ears are definitely more sensitive. I think that's why they
mhm,
have like this height. Like it's one of the reasons I was interested in writing about it, just because
yeah.
it's so much more heightened than you see in humans.
Wow. So let's go to the next topic,
Okay.
which is brain function and development.
Yep.
So the optic tecton, it's the research of on the forebrain and
Hmm.
hindbrain. So what is that? What is the optic tecton?
Yeah. So the optic tectum is a part of the brain in owls, which allows for tuning of different frequencies.
Yeah,
So in other mammals, I think it's referred. Oh my God, sorry. Referred
it's
to as
okay.
the corpus. I don't remember what it's called. Hold on. Can I go back for a second?
Mm,
The superior colliculus in other
Calculus, yeah.
mammals. But in owls, let's see here. They use different frequencies, and
Mhm,
they're bimodal auditory visual neurons within the optic tectum
uh-huh.
that involve the ILD and ITD differences.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of like it. I don't know. It kind of describes how they're doing this whole processing. Like it's the part of the brain that's like most vital for hearing.
Like for people that don't understand that, do you mind
Yeah,
like simplify it?
yeah. So
Yeah.
it's basically the part of the brain that just like processes what they're hearing. Like the
Okay.
different frequencies, just like to put it in simpler terms, like a frequency is just like a level of sound.
Yeah.
So it's kind of the part of their brain that allows them to
Mhm.
um like understand what they're hearing.
Yeah, fair enough. So it's something like language, right? So
Hmm.
we're speaking English, and like right now, like the sound that I am like expressing and what you're hearing, it's that it is the same system as that, right? So
Yeah.
like for example, I'm saying the word hey. So like when you hear the word hey, like automatically like it'll go to your brain and talk about the definition of hey, and you know like how to react back to me,
Hmm.
right?
I think it's sort of different, like especially in terms of language, because like obviously like owls don't really have, or at least that we know of, don't have like a definitive language that they're
Right.
speaking. I think it's more just like certain cues. Like
uh,
obviously when they're in their like tracking prey mode, they're going to be
yeah.
more like apt to hearing things and knowing like what they're going to have to hunt down versus like what's just like a ruffling leaf or something like that, you know?
Wow. So like let's talk about the connection to both adaptive plasticity,
Hmm.
which you have mentioned before,
Yeah.
and brain function in the optic tecton, covers sites of auditory plasticity in the brain stem, revealed by who's that? Like
Monaural
monaural,
occlusion.
yeah.
Yeah, so just like to simplify monaural occlusion, when I first started writing about it, I had no idea what it was. It's basically
Uh-huh.
just like a block in like how they develop their hearing. Like it's like kind of like an interference, like
Mhm.
something that like keeps them from like being like as accurate as they possibly can, or like having like the most um like like perfect hearing, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I talk about a study that was conducted by Mogdens and Knudsen that
Hmm.
found that the optic tectum includes auditory maps of interaural level difference.
Yeah.
So basically just maps of auditory space. Like I talked before, like they're kind of just creating these maps.
Yeah.
And then throughout the study, they emphasize that monaural occlusion changes these levels. So it's kind of
Mhm.
interfering with that and like changing the way
Yeah.
that they are able to hear, and alters different responses and like reaction time and like
Yeah.
creation of these auditory maps.
It's like for those map, is it like a schema? And
Yeah,
yeah.
kind of, yeah.
So like in simple terms, can I take it as like the owls have a schema, and like
Mhm.
the more the owls like know about what they're doing, they reach the schema
Yeah.
faster.
Yeah.
And like the more like for example like because we're like a psychology major, right?
Yeah.
And we don't know much about like for example anthropology.
Mhm.
So like we have a bunch of schemas in psychology. So like when we talk about psychology, our brain would be like, oh, we're going to talk here, here, here,
Yeah.
here, here. And but when we go to anthropology, like when we have no idea, maybe we heard like one or two stories before, we'll be like, oh, I kind of know what's going on, but like what is going on?
Yeah.
So like, can I take it as like that situation for
Yeah,
owls?
I definitely think it's a little different, but like I think in terms of like them over time, like they're definitely like creating like over like when they have more experience, especially when hunting and like just like over like time hearing throughout
Yeah.
their lives, I think it's definitely could be related to that.
Yeah. So what is adaptive plasticity?
Yeah, so going back to that, it's kind of just an animal's ability to alter its physiology to
Uh-huh.
fit certain phenotypes, like depending on the environment they're in. So like say there's an owl in one environment in like a really cold, dark environment, and then you have another owl in a totally different environment. And I focus mainly on barred owls,
Okay.
but yeah, it's just kind of this ability that mammals have to kind of like shape not shape shift, but kind of
Mhm.
adapt to what they need to do based on the environment they're in.
Yeah. So is it like attachment theory?
No, I think it's
No.
kind of different. Yeah, it's just kind of like this. adaptation that they have like going on.
So it's like when you go to a new environment
Hmm.
and the else is like, oh, I feel like that's like okay, so like us when we go to a new environment, we feel like we'll feel like what is that word? Like cautious,
Hmm.
we feel like insecure and
Yeah.
like I think a very good example is like when we just came to the school and we are
Yeah.
like, oh, like there's a bunch of like random people around me.
Yeah.
And like once we're like getting involved ourselves into the school, we'll be like, oh, like I know who this guy is. I know who that
Hmm.
guy are. And like we start to like let go our like insecurity and
Yeah.
like just join the environment. So it's just
Yeah.
something like that.
I think like kind of like especially with swimming too, like
Yeah.
obviously when we first came here, like we
Yeah.
didn't swim right away. So
Uh-huh.
I think it kind of could be related to like us coming to school and then
Uh-huh.
swimming and then having to adapt to going to class and swim and like
Uh-huh.
get into like a routine, like adapting to what we need to do because like our like
Yeah.
schedule like fits
So the
that way.
keyword is the routine.
Yeah,
Routine
kind of
is
like a
keyword.
routine,
Yeah.
like just like fitting the
Uh-huh.
schedule, kind of like
Yeah.
in simpler terms, I would say.
Wow. So how do you observe adaptive plasticity with owls?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So finding research on that was actually kind of hard, but I did find a study that showed that adaptive plasticity was critical in auditory sense and was
Yeah.
responsible for different adaptive changes, sorry, at different levels of developing hearing.
Uh-huh.
So another study shows that there's like an inactivation of inhibition, which was mediated through aminobutyric acid type A receptors, which when I
Right.
first read, I was like, I have no idea what's going on.
Yep.
But it just basically showed that there was like a result in
Mm,
different strengths of like kind of like inhibitions or just like difficulties
right.
across certain like networks of hearing
Mhm.
of the owl's brain, like showed through their brain processing.
Long word short. What is it?
Yeah, so it's I to simplify it more,
Yeah.
the adaptive plasticity can be responsible for changes in the hearing. Yeah.
Simple.
Yeah.
Just that simple. So you wrote that adaptive plasticity
Hmm.
of auditory space maps within the optic tectum between baby born owls and the adult. Like, what is that?
Yeah, so kind of going back to what I was talking about before, like that the critical stage of hearing development, like
Yeah.
with the 2 weeks post hatch and like 2 months of like main development. I kind of just talked about a study that compared juvenile owls, so like really young adult
Right.
owls that were still like growing in their hearing, and then other owls that didn't have their hearing inhibited at all. So
Mm,
they it's going to get a little complicated with the terms here, but they examined
okay.
broadband and narrowband ITD and ILD in normal adult owls and then compared the results to those who were raised with a filtering device on one of their ears. So basically, they were just like to put it in simple terms, like they were analyzing owls that had normal hearing, like nothing going on. They didn't
Mm,
like do anything to them
yeah.
or their ears or anything. And then they had these adolescent owls that were younger that they
Mm,
altered their hearing by putting a
right.
device in one of their ears. So they kind of wanted to see how that would cause changes, and they found that it caused frequency dependent changes
Mm,
with changes in sound levels and timing. So
right.
like if something was obstructing one of their ears, then that in that critical stage, it changed the way that they process different sounds.
I mean, like putting device in else, like I just think that it will like harm that a lot. Cause
Yeah.
like, look, owls like before that we talk about owls depend on hearing in order
Yeah.
to like strike its prey, right?
Yeah.
So like, imagine if you like a newborn owl, like you just put like what is that like an electronic gadget
Yeah.
in its ear, and like it will like disrupt their frequency of listening, right?
Oh yeah, it definitely has like a long lasting impact on their hearing. And I kind of reading through a lot of the studies had like a lot to do with that and like kind of use
Yeah,
the same research.
because it's like 2 weeks to 2 months, right?
2 weeks to 2 months is
Two
like the
months.
vital stage.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
imagine if you put like those electronic device in your ear, like
Yeah.
what will happen is that like when you take it off and they rely to that,
Hmm.
and do you think that they couldn't estimate like the sound frequencies from like other places?
I think it's definitely different than like the owls that didn't have any device, but I think
Uh,
that they have like the ability to adapt with the way that I think since they did it from such a young age, they have the
yeah.
ability to like adapt to
Mm,
the way that they like it's kind of like if someone's hearing impaired like as a human like has like
right.
a hard of hearing in one of their ears, like
Mm,
hearing aids or something, or just like kind
yeah.
of being more attentive to what people are saying, like lip reading. Like I think they have the ability to kind of like work with what they have and still
Yeah.
be able to live like a long and like successful life.
Yeah, like what when you mentioned hearing it, like
Hmm.
so like since the owl have that like device in their ear,
Yeah.
do you think that they will rely on it or like let's say when you take it off, they'll like after that 2 months you take it off and the owl be like, oh my gosh, I just couldn't like adapt to the whole thing, and like that's where like adaptive plasticity come in and where they have to like get
Yeah.
used to it again. Because like after the 2 months, I believe like us when we like try to learn a language,
Hmm.
like often a certain age, like even right now when we're learning language, it's like a huge hustle for us.
Yeah.
So like for else it's like 2 weeks, 2 months, right?
Hmm.
So after the 2 months period, and like you take it off, and they have to adapt to like you without using that like technology. Like, what do
Right.
you think would happen to the owl?
I think it's more, I don't really think it would have that much of an impact. I think it's like like kind of like, to put it in simple terms, like the damage was already done. You know
Yeah,
what I mean? Like they're already like, their hearing has already like altered because of the device, and it's
yeah.
because it was in the most like vital stage of hearing development, it's going to
Uh-huh.
stay that way. So I really don't think it'll be like that much of a change, like even with or without the device was just to change it in the first place,
Okay.
you know.
Yeah, fair
Yeah.
enough. Ooh, so let's go to inaccuracies,
Okay.
right? So sound, of course, sound localizations is all
Yeah.
about the ear. So how do owl detect sound localizations?
So owls are typically observed using their interaural level differences, which is the ILDs, for sound localization,
Yeah.
and when they're not consistent and accurate. So there's
Okay.
differences in sound frequencies that can alter brain signaling in owls.
Right.
And then the higher frequency sounds can sometimes allow the midbrain to signal multiple locations, which lead to like an elusive or incorrect phantom source, which basically means that they think that they're hearing something, but it's incorrect. Like it's not at all what they thought.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's kind of just like a inaccuracy going on there. And then the interaural level difference and interaural time difference both showed that with support, though, they
Mhm.
can decrease the probability of owls being deceived through these elusive sources. So kind of like their ability to have like these binaural auditory localization cues and
Right.
like the interaural level difference and time differences like are all things that like kind of pile up to help them be as accurate as they can when hunting.
In simple terms, can I say like hallucinating but listening instead?
Yeah, kind
Yeah.
of like they think they're hearing something, but it's just it's in the brain, like it's like too many things at once and it's thinking it's something else. Yeah.
Wow. So the last question is
Hmm.
that you mentioned critical period in terms of recovery of sound localization.
Hmm.
Like, can you talk about that?
Yeah, so in the last part of my paper I talked about another study by Knudsen in
Yeah.
1984, which talks about the critical periods in terms of recovery of sound localization.
Yeah.
So throughout the study they basically just discussed the owl's ability to remember sound localization accurately
Mhm.
after they were raised in an environment with one occluded ear, which kind of goes back to what I was saying, like the
Yeah.
device in one of their ears.
Mhm.
So when they were removed, the owl showed large systematic and sound localization errors. So it basically just impaired their hearing for the rest of their life. And when they reached a certain age, they decreased in their ability to recover accurate localizations.
Yeah.
So basically, it says the critical period takes place between 38 to 42 weeks, which I
Wow.
guess is longer than, definitely longer than 2 months. But
Yeah.
yeah,
All right. Thank you
yeah,
so much for being here.
yeah, of course. Thank you for
So,
having
do you
me.
want to say anything to to the viewers before?
Yeah,
All right.
basically, this was a really interesting paper to write. I enjoyed writing it. I enjoyed the class very much. I thought that talking about animals is not really something you think of when coming to psychology, but
Yeah.
it was definitely a good experience.
Especially when we're in the same class.
Yeah, with the same teacher, a great teacher.
Yep.
So yeah, thank
Right.
you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.